David rubbed his tired eyes and stared at the pile of electronic equipment scattered across his garage floor. Wires snaked everywhere like digital spaghetti, connecting old satellite dishes to computer monitors that flickered with strange readings. His neighbors probably thought he was crazy, and honestly, he was starting to wonder if they were right. For 3 whole years, he had been building something that shouldn't even exist. His friends called it his space radio, but it was much more than that. David worked as a regular scientist at a research center in Nevada, but this project was all his own. Every spare dollar from his paycheck went into buying used parts, old military equipment, and anything else that might help him reach out to distant worlds. The idea started simple enough. Scientists had discovered a planet called Kepler 442b that might have water and maybe even life. David became obsessed with the thought that someone out there might be looking up at their own sky, wondering if they were alone too. So he decided to say hello. Tonight felt different, though. David had been working for 16 hours straight at his day job, running calculations and double-checking other people's research. His head felt fuzzy and his hands shook slightly as he adjusted the transmission settings. The desert air was perfectly clear, with stars twinkling like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Perfect conditions for sending a message across the galaxy. He typed in the coordinates for Kepler 442b, or at least where he thought it would be. Space moves fast, and calculating where a planet will be months later when your signal finally arrives is like trying to hit a baseball while riding a roller coaster in the dark. But David had done this dozens of times before. He knew what he was doing, or so he thought. His fingers moved automatically across the keyboard, entering frequency numbers and power settings. But exhaustion played tricks on his brain. Instead of typing 442.7 for the planet's designation code, his tired fingers hit 447.2. A small mistake, just a few numbers off. In normal circumstances, this would simply mean his message would shoot off into empty space and disappear forever. But space isn't as empty as we think it is. David pressed the big red button marked Transmit and sat back in his folding chair. The equipment hummed to life with a sound like a giant bee trapped in a metal box. Lights flashed in patterns across his homemade control panel. Somewhere above his head, invisible radio waves carrying humanity's simple greeting shot out into the darkness at the speed of light. The message itself was nothing fancy. David had spent weeks crafting what he thought was the perfect first contact communication. Mathematical sequences that any intelligent species would recognize, followed by simple pictures showing Earth, humans, and basic information about our solar system. He ended it with audio recordings of music, different languages, and the sound of children playing. If someone was out there listening, David wanted them to know that humans were both intelligent and peaceful. What David didn't know was that his tiny mathematical error had sent his message along a completely different path. Instead of traveling through normal space toward a distant planet, the signal had somehow slipped sideways into what scientists might call a parallel dimension. A place where the rules of physics worked differently, and things that seemed impossible on Earth were perfectly normal. For 3 days, David waited. He kept his equipment running, scanning for any reply signals, but heard only the usual cosmic background noise. He told himself this was normal. After all, even if aliens existed and received his message instantly, any reply would take years to reach Earth. He was being impatient. But on the 3rd night, something changed. David was eating a sad dinner of cold pizza while reading scientific journals when his equipment started beeping. Not the usual random blips and static, but organized patterns. Signals that seemed to be growing stronger by the hour. His homemade receivers, built from old satellite parts, were picking up something extraordinary. The readings made no sense. According to his instruments, the signal wasn't coming from deep space. It was getting closer. Much closer, as if someone was actually traveling toward Earth. But that was impossible. Even the fastest spacecraft humans had ever built would take thousands of years to travel between stars. No technology could move that fast. David checked and rechecked his equipment, convinced something was broken. He ran diagnostic tests, replaced cables, and even smacked a few stubborn monitors that kept showing impossible readings. But everything checked out. His equipment was working perfectly. which meant something really was approaching Earth. Something that had received his message and decided to respond in person. As the hours passed, the signals grew stronger and more focused. David realized, with growing excitement and terror, that whatever was coming seemed to be heading directly for his house. His transmission equipment had apparently worked like a beacon, showing the visitors exactly where to find him. He tried calling his colleagues at work, but how do you explain that your garage experiment might have made first contact with aliens? They would think he had finally lost his mind. Besides, what if he was wrong? What if this was all just equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference? He would look like a fool. So David waited alone in his garage, surrounded by blinking lights and humming machines, watching as something impossible traveled across space and time to meet him. He had wanted to make contact with another world, and apparently he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But as he would soon discover, sometimes getting what you wish for is the most dangerous thing that can happen to you. The readings continued to spike, growing stronger with each passing minute. Whatever was coming would arrive soon, and David had no idea what he had accidentally invited into his quiet suburban life. His simple message to a distant planet had somehow opened a door between worlds, and something was about to step through. All he could do now was wait and hope that whoever was coming had peaceful intentions. After all, if they were hostile, there was nothing a tired scientist with homemade equipment could do to stop them. David had just changed the course of human history with a few mistyped numbers, and he didn't even know it yet. David jolted awake to the sound of every alarm in his house going off at once. His phone was buzzing, his smoke detector was beeping, and somewhere in the garage, his homemade equipment was screaming like a fire truck. The digital clock next to his bed showed 3:47 a.m. in angry red numbers. He stumbled out of bed, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The hallway felt different somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. His bare feet slapped against the cold tile as he rushed toward the garage, fumbling for light switches that didn't seem to work anymore. The garage door was already open, though David couldn't remember leaving it that way. Inside, his equipment was going absolutely crazy. Lights flashed in patterns he had never seen before, and the monitors showed readings that made his stomach drop. Energy signatures were appearing not somewhere out in space, but right here in his own house. According to his instruments, something was materializing in his living room. David ran back inside, his mouth dry with fear and excitement. The living room looked normal at first glance, but then he noticed the air. It was shimmering like heat waves rising from summer pavement, except the room felt ice cold. He reached out to touch the strange distortion and immediately pulled his hand back. The air felt electric, like touching a balloon after rubbing it on your hair. His television flickered and died. The microwave in the kitchen started beeping random patterns. Even his digital watch stopped working, its display showing nothing but scrambled symbols. Whatever was happening was affecting every electronic device in the house. Then the air began to tear. David watched in amazement and terror as reality itself seemed to rip open like fabric. The tear started small, maybe the size of a dinner plate, but quickly grew larger. Through the opening, he could see another place entirely. Not another planet or country, but somewhere that looked like it existed under completely different rules. The sky was purple and strange floating objects drifted past like jellyfish made of light. And then she stepped through. The woman was unlike anyone David had ever seen, yet somehow familiar, like a character from a half-remembered dream. She was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, with skin so pale it seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her hair was black as midnight and moved as if she was underwater, even though there was no wind in the room. But it was her eyes that made David's breath catch in his throat. They shifted color like oil on water, moving from deep purple to silver and back again. When she looked at him, he felt like she could see straight through to his soul. Her clothes were the strangest part. They looked like they were made from shadow itself, flowing and changing shape as she moved. The material seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the unsettling impression that parts of her were missing, cut out from reality. David opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The woman tilted her head, studying him with curiosity rather than hostility. When she finally spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, like surround sound speakers hidden throughout the room. "You are the one who sent the signal," she said, though her lips barely moved. Somehow David understood her perfectly, even though he was pretty sure she wasn't speaking English. The words just appeared in his mind, complete with meaning and context. David nodded, not trusting his voice yet. His scientific brain was racing, trying to process what he was seeing. This was first contact, the moment humans had dreamed about for centuries. But instead of little green men in flying saucers, he was face to face with someone who looked like she had stepped out of a gothic fairy tale. "I did not mean to come here," the woman continued, looking around the room with what seemed like mild annoyance. "Your transmission created an unexpected pathway between our dimensions. I was investigating the strange signal when your continued broadcasting pulled me through against my will." David finally found his voice. "Dimensions? You mean you're not from another planet?" The woman almost smiled at that, showing teeth that were slightly too sharp to be entirely human. "Your species thinks so small. Planets, solar systems, galaxies. You see only what exists in your single layer of reality. There are countless worlds occupying the same space as yours, separated only by frequency and vibration." She walked around his living room, her movements unnaturally graceful, like she was floating just slightly above the ground. Everything she touched seemed to respond to her presence. The dead television flickered back to life briefly, showing images of her world, before going dark again. "In my realm, I am what you might call a researcher, much like yourself," she explained. "But where I come from, we evolved differently. We do not consume physical matter for sustenance as you do. Instead, we feed on energy, particularly the type generated by strong emotions and intellectual activity." David felt a chill run down his spine. "Feed on energy? You mean like a vampire?" "Yes," she said, apparently reading his thoughts, though not in the crude way your stories describe. "We do not require blood or violence. Emotional energy, freely given, sustains us much more efficiently. In my world, this exchange is voluntary and beneficial to both parties." She moved closer to David, and he could feel something like a gentle warmth radiating from her skin. It wasn't threatening, more like standing near a cozy fireplace. "My name is Vera," she said, "and I find myself in quite a predicament. The dimensional tear that brought me here is unstable. It will collapse soon, but not quickly enough for me to return safely. I am, as you might say, stranded in your reality." David's mind reeled with possibilities, an actual interdimensional being, stuck in his house depending on him for help. This was beyond anything he had ever imagined when he started his garage experiment. "How long do you have?" he asked. Vera gestured toward the slowly shrinking tear in his living room wall. "Perhaps a few of your days, maybe a week at most. After that, the passage will seal permanently. I will be trapped here until I find another way home, if such a way exists." David looked at this incredible being standing in his ordinary suburban living room and realized that his life had just become anything but ordinary. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to his simple existence as a small-town scientist with big dreams. The most important question of his life had just walked through a hole in reality, and David had no idea what to do about it. The next morning felt like waking up from the strangest dream, except Vera was still there, sitting cross-legged on David's couch, staring at his collection of science magazines with intense fascination. She hadn't moved much during the night, and David wondered if beings from her dimension even needed sleep. "These publications contain remarkable insights into your species' understanding of physics," she said without looking up as David stumbled into the kitchen for coffee. "Though you have several fundamental misconceptions about the nature of dimensional barriers." David poured himself the strongest cup of coffee he had ever made and sat down across from her. In the morning light streaming through his windows, Vera looked somehow more solid, more real. But her otherworldly nature was still obvious in the way shadows seemed to bend around her and how his houseplants had started growing toward her like she was made of sunlight. "So," David said, trying to sound casual while talking to an interdimensional being, "you mentioned that you need energy to survive. How exactly does that work? Vera set down the magazine and looked at him with those color-shifting eyes. In my world, we form partnerships with willing hosts. The process is quite pleasant for both parties. We absorb emotional energy, particularly the intense feelings generated by curiosity, wonder, and intellectual discovery. In return, we share knowledge and enhance our partner's mental capabilities. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. However, your dimension operates under different rules. I am not certain how the process will affect you or if it will work at all. Without a proper energy source, I will gradually fade until I simply cease to exist. David felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. The scientist in him was absolutely fascinated by the possibility of learning about her world and the physics that governed it. But the human part of him worried about what absorbing energy might actually mean. What would happen if we tried it? He asked. Vera tilted her head, studying him. You would likely experience intensified emotions and enhanced mental clarity. Your capacity for understanding complex concepts would temporarily increase. For me, it would provide the sustenance I need to remain stable in this dimension. David thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Let's try it. The process was nothing like what David had expected. Vera simply placed her hand on his forehead, and suddenly his mind felt like it had been plugged into a high-voltage power line. Colors seemed brighter, sounds more distinct. Most remarkably, concepts that had always seemed impossibly complex suddenly made perfect sense. For the first time in his life, David truly understood quantum mechanics, not just the equations, but the actual reality behind them. He could visualize how dimensions folded into each other, see the mathematical relationships that govern space and time itself. It was like someone had replaced his regular brain with a supercomputer. This is incredible, he breathed, and Vera smiled, looking more vibrant than she had since arriving. The feeling is mutual, she said. Your species generates the most fascinating type of curiosity energy I have ever encountered. Most beings in my dimension have grown complacent with their knowledge. But humans, you never stop asking what, if, and why. It is quite nourishing. Over the following days, they settled into an unusual but comfortable routine. David would work on his regular job during the day, though his colleagues started noticing that his research proposals had become remarkably advanced overnight. When he returned home, he and Vera would spend hours discussing the physics of her dimension, the nature of interdimensional travel, and the possibilities for future contact between their worlds. Each evening, Vera would perform the energy exchange that kept her alive, and David would experience those incredible moments of enhanced understanding. He started making breakthrough discoveries in theoretical physics that normally would have taken teams of researchers years to develop. But the situation wasn't without its complications. Dr. Thompson, David's supervisor at the research center, had started asking uncomfortable questions about David's sudden leap in capabilities. During their weekly review meetings, Thompson would stare at David's latest papers with a mixture of amazement and suspicion. These calculations are extraordinary, David, Thompson said, holding up a research proposal that detailed a completely new approach to faster-than-light communication. Where did you get these ideas? Some of these theories are decades ahead of current scientific understanding. David tried to deflect the questions, claiming he had been doing extensive research in his spare time, but he could see Thompson wasn't buying it. His supervisor was too smart and had known David too long to believe he had suddenly transformed into a super genius overnight. Meanwhile, Vera was dealing with her own moral struggles. During one of their evening discussions, she confessed her concerns about their arrangement. In my world, energy exchange is always consensual and mutual, she said, pacing around David's living room with obvious agitation. Both parties benefit equally, and either can end the partnership at any time. But here, you are dependent on me for knowledge that could advance your entire species, while I am dependent on you for my very existence. The power dynamic is unhealthy. David tried to reassure her that he was participating willingly, that he found their exchanges fascinating rather than draining. But Vera remained troubled. I have been observing your behavior, she said. You have become more focused on our research together, less interested in your normal social activities. Your emotional patterns are shifting to optimize the energy I can absorb. I fear I may be inadvertently influencing your mind to ensure my survival." This revelation worried David more than he wanted to admit. Had his enthusiasm for their partnership been entirely his own choice? Or was Vera somehow manipulating his emotions? The enhanced mental clarity he experienced during their exchanges made it impossible to think objectively about the situation. But despite the complications, David found himself genuinely caring about Vera as a person, not just as a source of incredible scientific knowledge. She was curious about everything human, from the way his coffee maker worked, to why he kept photographs of family members on his walls. Her questions about human nature were often more insightful than those of most humans he knew. "Your species forms emotional attachments to individuals you may never see again," she observed, examining his family photos. "In my world, relationships are primarily functional. We partner for mutual benefit. But we do not experience what you call love or friendship. It seems both wonderful and terrifying." As the week progressed, the dimensional tear in David's living room continued to shrink. Soon it would be too small for Vera to pass through, sealing her fate in his dimension permanently. The clock was ticking on finding a solution, and David realized he wasn't sure he wanted to find one. For the first time in his life, he wasn't alone with his passion for understanding the universe. Vera shared his curiosity, his wonder at the complexity of existence. The thought of losing that connection, of returning to his ordinary life, felt like losing a part of himself. But keeping her here meant trapping her forever in a world that wasn't her own, dependent on him for survival. It was a choice that would define both of their futures, and David had no idea what the right answer was. Time was running out, and neither of them was ready to say goodbye. Dr. Thompson stood outside David's house at 6 a.m., holding a clipboard and trying to look casual. She had been David's supervisor for 5 years and thought she knew him pretty well. The quiet, hard-working scientist who submitted decent research and never caused any trouble. But in the past 2 weeks, David had turned into some kind of genius, and Thompson was determined to figure out how. She walked around the property, noting the unusual collection of satellite equipment scattered across the backyard. David had always been a bit of a hobby scientist, but this setup looked more sophisticated than anything their government research facility owned. More concerning were the strange electromagnetic readings her handheld detector was picking up. The levels were off the charts. Thompson pulled out her phone and dialed her contact at the Department of Energy. "This is Dr. Thompson. I need to report some unusual radiation signatures at a private residence. The readings don't match anything in our database." Inside the house, Vera suddenly went rigid, her color-shifting eyes wide with alarm. "Someone is outside," she whispered urgently to David, who was eating breakfast and reviewing the latest physics equations she had taught him. "They have detection equipment. Your government agencies are investigating." David nearly choked on his cereal. "What? How do you know?" "I can sense electromagnetic fields and energy patterns," Vera explained, moving away from the windows. "There is a woman outside scanning your property with some kind of radiation detector. The readings from my presence here must have attracted attention." David peeked through his bedroom curtains and saw Thompson walking around his yard with what looked like a Geiger counter. His heart sank. Thompson was brilliant, persistent, and had connections throughout the government scientific community. If she suspected something unusual was happening, she wouldn't stop investigating until she found answers. "This is bad," David muttered. "Thompson has been asking questions about my research improvements. If she finds evidence of, well, there's no telling what might happen." Vera looked genuinely concerned for the first time since arriving. "In my dimension, first contact between species is handled very carefully, with extensive preparation and diplomatic protocols. Your species appears to respond to the unknown with fear and attempts at control." Over the next few days, the situation escalated rapidly. Thompson's initial report triggered a joint investigation involving NASA, military intelligence, and something called the Special Phenomena Research Division that David had never heard of. Black SUVs started appearing on his street at random times. His phone calls were clearly being monitored, and he was pretty sure someone had been in his house while he was at work. Meanwhile, Vera was becoming increasingly unstable. The dimensional rift in David's living room had shrunk to the size of a dinner plate, and strange effects were spreading throughout the neighborhood. David's next-door neighbor complained that all her electronics had started malfunctioning. The local wildlife was acting bizarrely, with birds flying in perfect geometric patterns and dogs howling in harmony at exactly 3:47 a.m. every night. "My presence here is creating what you might call dimensional bleeding," Vera explained during one of their evening energy exchange sessions. "Reality is not meant to support beings from multiple dimensions simultaneously. The longer I remain, the more unstable your local space-time becomes." David felt the familiar rush of enhanced understanding as Vera's energy touched his mind, but this time it came with disturbing visions. He could see tiny tears in the fabric of reality, spreading out from his house like cracks in glass. If they continued to grow, the entire region could become a dimensional disaster zone. "How long do we have?" he asked. Vera's expression was grim. "Days, perhaps hours, before the instability becomes irreversible. But I cannot return through the rift in its current condition. The passage has become too small and chaotic. I would need enormous amounts of energy to force it open, more than you alone can provide." The next morning, David arrived at work to find Thompson waiting in his office with two men in dark suits. They introduced themselves as agents from the Special Phenomena Research Division, and their questions made it clear they knew far more than David was comfortable with. "We've detected unusual radiation patterns emanating from your residence," Agent Brooks said, consulting a file thick with photographs and technical readouts. "Energy signatures that don't correspond to any known terrestrial source. We also have reports of anomalous phenomena in your neighborhood, electronic failures, unusual animal behavior, unexplained atmospheric disturbances." David tried to play dumb, but Thompson was watching him with the sharp eyes of someone who had known him for years. She could tell he was hiding something important. "David," she said quietly, "whatever is going on, you can trust us. If you've made some kind of breakthrough, if you've discovered something significant, we need to know. Not to take credit or shut you down, but because it might be dangerous." Agent Richards leaned forward. "Our sensors indicate that whatever is generating these readings is becoming increasingly unstable. If this is some kind of experimental technology, it needs to be contained before it causes serious damage." David realized he was trapped between impossible choices. If he told the truth, government agents would swarm his house and probably take Vera away for study, assuming they didn't just try to destroy her as a threat. But if he stayed silent, the dimensional instability might tear apart his entire neighborhood. That evening, David sat in his living room with Vera, watching the dimensional rift pulse and flicker like a dying light bulb. The air around it was beginning to distort in ways that hurt to look at directly. "I've been thinking about your world," David said. "You mentioned that your people are facing problems with energy scarcity, that you're running out of resources." Vera nodded sadly. "Our civilization has grown too dependent on external energy sources. We have over-harvested our dimension's natural emotional reservoirs. Many of my people are already beginning to fade." David took a deep breath. "What if I told Thompson and the government agents the truth? Not about you specifically, but about interdimensional contact possibilities. What if we could establish official diplomatic relations between our worlds? Your species would see mine as invaders or parasites," Vera said. "Beings who feed on human emotions would be perceived as a threat, regardless of our peaceful intentions." "But what if we presented it differently?" David insisted. "What if we showed them that it could be mutually beneficial? Your people get the energy they need to survive, and humanity gains access to scientific knowledge that could advance our civilization by centuries." Vera looked at him with something that might have been hope. "It would require perfect timing and enormous trust from both sides, and we would still need to solve the immediate problem of stabilizing the dimensional rift before it destroys everything within a 50-mile radius." Outside, David could hear the rumble of heavy vehicles pulling up to his house. Through the window, he saw not just the black SUVs, but military trucks and what looked like a mobile laboratory. The investigation was about to become a full-scale operation. Time had run out for keeping secrets. Whatever happened next would determine not just Vera's fate, but possibly the future relationship between two entire dimensions. David had to make a choice that could change the course of human history, and he had about 5 minutes to decide. The front door exploded inward just as David was reaching for his phone to call Thompson. 6 agents in full tactical gear stormed into his living room, weapons drawn, shouting commands he couldn't process through his panic. Behind them came Thompson, her face pale with shock at the sight of the dimensional rift pulsing like a wounded animal in the corner of the room. But it was Vera's reaction that turned everything into chaos. Startled by the sudden invasion, her control over her interdimensional abilities slipped. The dimensional tear, which had been slowly shrinking, suddenly expanded like a popped balloon. The room filled with swirling energy that made every electronic device in a 3-block radius go haywire. Agent Brooks was shouting into his radio, but only static came out. The tactical team's equipment failed completely, leaving them standing with useless gear as reality warped around them. Through the expanding rift, everyone could see into Vera's dimension with its purple sky and floating crystalline structures that defied every law of physics David knew. "Everyone stop!" David yelled over the chaos. "You're making it worse." Thompson, to her credit, held up a hand to halt her team. Her scientific mind was struggling to process what she was seeing, but she recognized a dangerous situation when she saw one. "What is that thing?" she demanded. David looked at Vera, who was pressed against the far wall, her form flickering between solid and translucent as she struggled to maintain stability in their dimension. The expanding rift was creating a feedback loop, threatening to tear open a permanent gateway that neither dimension could control. "Her name is Vera," David said simply. "She's from another dimension, and she needs our help." The next few minutes were the most intense of David's life. While agents called for backup and Thompson tried to take readings with her equipment, the dimensional rift continued expanding. David could see the terror in Vera's eyes as she fought to contain energies that were beyond her control. "The barrier between dimensions is collapsing," Vera managed to say, her voice echoing strangely as reality bent around her. "If it fully opens, the interaction between our realities could destroy both worlds." Thompson's scientific instincts kicked in. "What do we need to do?" she asked, stepping forward despite the danger. "We need to overload the rift with precisely controlled energy to make it collapse cleanly," Vera explained. "But it requires perfect timing and more power than any single being can provide." David realized what she meant. The energy exchange process. If multiple people participated simultaneously, could that generate enough power? Vera nodded, though she looked uncertain. "In theory, yes. But I have never attempted such a thing with your species. The process could be dangerous for human minds." Thompson was already rolling up her sleeves. "What are the risks?" "Temporary disorientation, possible unconsciousness, but no permanent damage if done correctly," Vera said. Agent Brooks stepped forward, his weapon lowered but ready. "This is insane. We don't know anything about this creature or what it wants." "What I want," Vera said, her voice carrying a note of dignity despite her desperate situation, "is to prevent 2 worlds from being destroyed by an accident I helped cause. Your species may be primitive in some ways, but you do not deserve annihilation." David looked around the room at the faces of people who had to make an impossible decision. Thompson was clearly fascinated by the scientific implications. The agents were trained to see threats everywhere, but even they could see that Vera was trying to help, rather than harm. "We do this together, or we all suffer the consequences together," David said. "Thompson, I trust you. Do you trust me?" Thompson looked at the expanding dimensional rift, at the equations she was scribbling on her notepad that made no sense according to conventional physics, and at Vera's desperate expression. "This is either the greatest scientific discovery in human history or the end of the world," she muttered. "Either way, we can't just stand here and watch." The process was unlike anything David had experienced before. With Thompson and two of the agents participating, the energy exchange became a shared consciousness event. David felt his mind connecting not just with Vera, but with the other humans as well. For a brief moment, all five of them experienced the universe from each other's perspectives. Thompson's methodical scientific approach merged with Agent Brooks's tactical thinking and Vera's interdimensional awareness. David felt the agent's training in crisis management combine with his own passion for discovery and Vera's desperate hope for survival. Together, their combined mental energy created something far more powerful than the sum of its parts. The dimensional rift pulsed once, twice, then collapsed in on itself with a sound like reality sighing in relief. The strange distortions in the air disappeared, and David's electronics flickered back to life. For a moment, everyone stood in stunned silence. "Is it over?" Thompson asked. Vera looked around the room, her form now solid and stable. The immediate crisis has passed, but the process has created something unexpected. She gestured to a small, barely visible shimmer in the air where the large rift had been. A micro-portal, stable, permanent, but only large enough for communication. Agent Brooks was already on his radio, calling off the emergency response teams. But David could see the wheels turning in Thompson's head as she realized the implications. Communication with another dimension, she breathed. The knowledge we could share, the problems we could solve together. Over the following months, the microportal became the foundation for humanity's first interdimensional diplomatic relationship. Working under the strictest secrecy, Thompson established a special research division dedicated to cross-dimensional cooperation. Vera became humanity's first interdimensional ambassador, teaching human scientists about physics beyond their wildest dreams, while learning about human culture and society. The energy crisis in Vera's dimension was solved through a remarkable breakthrough. Human scientists, working with Vera's people, developed artificial emotional energy generators that could sustain her species without requiring host relationships. In return, Vera's people shared technology that revolutionized human understanding of space, time, and consciousness. David found himself at the center of it all, serving as the primary liaison between the two worlds. His garage laboratory became the unofficial embassy between dimensions, with Thompson heading up the official government research program. But perhaps the most important change was personal. David was no longer the lonely scientist dreaming of contact with distant worlds. He had found something better than the alien civilizations he had imagined. He had found friends across the barriers of reality itself, partners in exploring the infinite possibilities of existence. On quiet evenings, David would sit in his living room, watching the barely visible shimmer of the microportal, listening to Vera's reports about the progress her people were making with their new energy sources. Sometimes Thompson would join them, bringing updates on the scientific papers they were preparing to revolutionize human physics. The universe had turned out to be far stranger and more wonderful than David had ever imagined. His accidental signal hadn't just made first contact. It had opened the door to a future where the barriers between worlds were just another problem to be solved through cooperation and understanding. And it all started with a tired scientist making a simple mistake while reaching for the stars.